Welcome to the Transforming Trauma Podcast, a complex trauma podcast through the NARM Training Institute. My name is Sarah Buino, and I'm so excited to be sharing today's interview with you. Hey, Transforming Trauma listeners. Please join us starting in November for our online NARM Basics training to learn how to transform trauma. This online NARM Basics training is available for professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Now more than ever before, it is essential that we learn how to resolve complex trauma and support post-traumatic growth. NARM provides a relational approach to addressing the current COVID pandemic and tools to support healing in the aftermath of this collective trauma. If you're looking for more advanced training in complex trauma and are working in mental health, healthcare, education, substance abuse recovery, or allied fields, join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. For more information and to apply, please visit www.narmtraining.com/online-basics. And here's a little bit about today's guest, Lynn Feinberg. She says this about herself. I am a historian of religion and rabbi presently working on a PhD in the University of Oslo. In my thesis, I explore post-traumatic growth and trauma integration in children and grandchildren of Norwegian Holocaust survivors. During the course of my studies, I have completed the NARM training and apply some of the concepts learned through NARM in my approach to my interviews and analysis. I am the daughter of a Norwegian survivor of Auschwitz, my father, and grew up belonging to the very small post-Holocaust Jewish community in Oslo. This background has brought me on a lifelong journey in exploring and seeking healing for my own complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I have therefore chosen to autoethnograph perspectives in my PhD work. I work as a spiritual director and include a NARM perspective in my work with my clients. So please enjoy this interview with Lynn Feinberg. Hi, Lynn. Welcome to Transforming Trauma. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. Yes, doing very well. Yes.
Wonderful. Well, I'm really excited to speak with you based on your specialty. So let's jump into it. What would you like listeners to get out of your interview today?
Maybe a more nuanced understanding of the complexities of intergenerational trauma, yes, and how this can continue to work and these nuances of. I've been listening to Claude Caimy's post and learning so much from this, understanding how I, as a Jew, am in some ways, from a European perspective, almost like a white black, if you see what I mean. That there are these, because of this underprivileged ongoing undertones, even though it's almost invisible in my generation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we could explore that field together would be great.
Yeah, the nuances for sure. And that's what NARM does so well.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, why don't you tell listeners more about who you are and where you are, because you are also one of our international guests, and then what you're specializing in.
Yeah, so I'm born in Oslo, Norway. I'm a Norwegian-born Jew. So I suppose my story begins with that I'm born into a post-Shoah family. My father survived Auschwitz. All of his family were deported from Oslo in 1942 and sent to Auschwitz, and he was the only one to survive. So I grew up in the shadow of what I call the Shoah, the Holocaust. My mum is British. That's why I grew up speaking bilingual. I spoke English and Norwegian when I grew up. So she didn't have that direct impact of the Holocaust in her background. So I had a whole Jewish family in England, but I also was part of the Jewish community here, which is very, very small. It was never big. Jews were not allowed into this country until 1851, I think. Norway was under Denmark until 1814. And then when they wrote their new constitution, the second paragraph says Jews and Jesuits are not allowed into the kingdom. So this law was amended for Jews in 1851 and, strangely enough, much later for the Jesuits. But there was then humanistic forces within the Norwegian society that fought, especially a Norwegian poet who fought for the human rights and that Jews should be accepted as citizens within the Norwegian state. So my family came early in that journey, and they settled and they came. But it's not like in America where Jews have been much longer. But it's the same story because, it's this whole this is what I've been really writing about a lot, this whole emancipation story of adjusting to modernity and having to put aside a lot of one's maybe Jewish characteristics for good or for bad.
Mm-hmm.
And then comes the Holocaust, which somehow becomes like a double whammy because it reinforces so much of the previous traumatic experiences and puts them all into the forefront again.
Mm-hmm.
So what I grew up in was this very insular Jewish community, very small. And as soon as I grew up and became a teenager, I didn't want to have anything to do with that. But I was encouraged to go to Israel, like all my peers, Jewish peers were. I was very affected, I remember, by the Yom Kippur War when I was in my late teens. And that I think that prompted me to want to go to Israel because this whole existential, in order for our right to exist, we have to have Israel. That, I don't know, you probably recognize that from American Jews too. And this was very much reinforced in my upbringing. So that's sort of the background that I come from. Then there's been this very long life journey since I lived 2 years in Israel, learned to speak Hebrew. I went to art school at that time. I'm an artist to begin with.
Oh, wow.
And then I came back not to Norway, but to Denmark. So I ended up living 8 years in Denmark, where I met my husband and where I actually also met, life kind of intervened in very dramatic ways, I would say. And I had this kind of both a spiritual awakening, but also really breaking with my whole background. And I didn't kind of catch up with it until I came into my early 30s and I came back to Norway as a mother of 2 young boys and the single mother of 2 young boys.
Wow.
And since Norway is a social democratic society and all that, I had a lot of benefits as a result of that, which enabled me to go to university and still be able to take over my kids.
Wow.
So that's when I sort of started my academic journey, and first went into a school of business part-time and worked part-time. But then I got so involved with the psychology and I wanted to understand more of the psychology. So I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, and then they closed the intake at the master's program or the professional program for psychologists. So I ended up becoming a historian of religion.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Wow.
Because I was in my 30s and I had 2 kids. I didn't feel like waiting 5-6 years to be accepted for further training at that time. But then I thought that, no, I'm not really good at being an academic either. And at that time I was becoming very much involved in the Jewish community of Oslo. I had my kids in the Jewish community's kindergarten, which had been, so a lot of things were changed in the community in the early 80s. Because there was a young rabbi a Danish rabbi came in. So there was a lot of new dynamics within the Jewish community at that time. But as being part of the community and partaking in the Orthodox services, because that's also part of the story, is that the only community that is in town is an Orthodox community, where I, as a woman, had to sit up on the balcony and see my 2 little boys run downstairs. And my father, who was also alive at that time, he was busy with all his guy friends.
Wow.
And I was a single mom, so I didn't and their dad isn't Jewish, so that's also part of the story. But so I realized at that time I got involved with very much of feminist approaches to Judaism, and a lot of the stuff that I was reading was American women and both Jewish femininity, but also feminist Judaism, but also spirituality. I was very much into Kabbalah and reading. So it was like both a spiritual journey and a feminist journey. And I realized that I didn't really want to go and become an academic talking about. So after I finished my what's called a Confilol, which is a little bit more than a master's, it's somewhere between a master's and a PhD in history of religions, focusing on gender and Judaism and looking into the gender dichotomy in Judaism. I went on and was accepted at a rabbinical seminar in the States, where I officially began the training in 2002, but I already had my first visit in 2001. And I was ordained in 2010. So this was a training I could take because it was made for adult second profession students. And so I traveled to the States twice a year. And then I took most of my courses like with telephone conferences at night,
Wow.
yeah.
And then now your PhD work, will you tell us about that?
Yes, of course, because it brings it all together. I think
Exactly.
the rabbinical training was part of my, what shall I say, grounding myself in my own story and getting a deeper grip of what it was I was coming from, because the Judaism I grew up in was so shallow and so without content. It was a lot of cultural Judaism, but yeah, so I think that was owning myself in a larger perspective and from a more historical perspective, which is what I am just now also writing about in my thesis, is how that link is connected, how the Jewish history link is so connected also to this collective trauma story. Because what I have been for a long time really also understanding that some of what happened to me when I was in Denmark, which was very traumatic, I was with guys who were not good, for me, and like very traumatic kind of relationships, and realizing that my attracting that kind of relationship was directly related to my father's Holocaust experiences and journey.
Wow.
Even though he was very well functioning, and in many ways I can see that, he did have a lot of agency, which I have understood from the NARM experience, that helped him to be a successful survivor. But of course there was stuff not just in his personal story, but also in the family story and the collective story. So I've been doing therapy and even trauma therapy from the early 90s. I realized, I heard for the first time when I heard about that there was something that was called trauma therapy, but this was in another context called the Danish approach called bodynamic, but which also builds on Peter Levine's work.
Oh,
So I received that kind of training for many years. I even also took the first year training as a therapist there. So 3-4 years ago, when I was starting to think about this PhD project, it's almost like I'm bringing all the strings together in that I'm wanting to kind of show how this larger story fits into the smaller story and how it affects and how can we transcend it. So that's where my friend, who is one of the leading NARM therapists here in Norway, suggested, well, why don't you do the NARM training? Because that's what we work with. Is integrating trauma.
Wow, that's wonderful. And I just really appreciate you being so open with your own story. And I do think that's also part of the beauty of NARM that we really emphasize in the training is doing your own work. And it's so hard to be able to be in relation to a client if we're not really in touch with who we are. Yeah.
Yeah. There was something, now I lost it, but there was something about, and this whole thing of, which has also been a big aha for me this last year, is the disidentifying from my story. So in my thesis I have been interviewing several people who have either second or third generation backgrounds. So that's going to be part of the analysis chapter, which I haven't finished yet, but that's where I'm going with it. But what I'm seeing in my own life so clearly now is this identification with my personal story, and I think that's why it's not so difficult for me to talk about it, because it doesn't have all this emotional trigger anymore.
Yeah.
And that's from the many years of having worked with this aspect.
Yeah. Do you think you'd be able to get a little bit more specific? Because I want to make sure listeners understand the process of disidentification in NARM is really how we're relating to ourselves based on the information, right? So what was your connection to yourself before you found this disidentification, and then what was your relationship?
I think it's very apparent in my experience of being Jewish that it's as if I cannot quite identify with that collective Jewish kind of construct of we're the ones who survived the Holocaust and we have to keep on to that story for our bare lives, and we're the victims in the bigger picture. I'm not, I mean, I'm exaggerating it now.
Yeah, but that makes it very clear. Yeah.
And also, as I have gone deeper in becoming a rabbi, and obviously being the first female rabbi in Norway.
Really? Oh my gosh.
Really, really challenging the mold of what it means to be a rabbi also, and taking on my own spirituality, and more seeing that I cannot even use the Jewish, I can't relate directly to the Jewish tradition as it has been handed down, because it has so many of those older constructs in it that kind of uphold some of that victimhood.
Yeah.
And it's been a tough journey, believe me. But
Right. And I'm energetically feeling into you really relating to Claude and Claude's story with the
absolutely.
historical trauma of Black people in America.
Yes.
I'm really sensing that parallel.
Yes. And just even, I mean, I had a session with Brad yesterday, and just again realizing that there's even deeper levels of this. Yeah, this not because one of the foci of my thesis is belonging. And how there's a sense of my experiencing within friends, and because I grew up as being the only Jew in my class, and my brother and I were the only Jews in the whole school. So this whole sense of adapting to a culture that in some ways was not quite mine, and that there was a whole culture that I also came with that had no mirror, and how that is still somehow playing in close relationships with friends that I've known since childhood.
Yeah. And in this, I'm almost hearing just like a child who's in a dysfunctional family system, who's essentially being like, this doesn't feel good, this isn't right, but you're kind of being gaslit to go along with the family to maintain attachment.
Exactly.
But then you're talking about this on a macro level of being a Jew and not feeling like something's not right here.
Exactly.
Wow.
And this whole balance, like, I feel it's, when I say these kind of things to other fellow Jews, they almost look upon me as like an anti-Semite, or,
Wow.
So
say more. Sorry, I'm just blown away by that.
So this has been some of the challenge when I I needed to have more personal sessions in order to have my training completed. So it was fantastic then to come across Brad and realize that that he actually was so much into this kind of understanding, and start to work with it from a deeper level, and even more realizing the complexity of the story, and made it so that it's, because I really don't want to end up being either for or against, but it's more like Claude was saying in the interview with you, it's about really getting into that experience of compassion for myself, my people, for our journey, for what it means to adjust within all those different layers. I mean, obviously those layers are also translated into the family systems, for sure.
Yeah, and I keep, as I deepen my education and learning with NARM, I keep recognizing the two sides of the same coin, right? If we identify something as good or bad, we're still stuck in the binary.
Exactly.
And what you're doing is disidentifying from that.
Yes. So that disidentifying piece is so important for me to find a way to express. I mean, it's the disidentification process, and then I'm also seeing it's also about bringing in a larger story, so that your story can be held in a larger story. And the more you can contain that larger story, the more you can also relax in your own story.
Right. I just wanted to give that a breath because, I'm feeling the depth of this. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm really personally curious about the intersection of feminism and Judaism. I had one client who was Orthodox Jewish female client, and I learned so much from her. And I always found myself going, why do you have to cover your hair? Why all these things? And so I'm so curious what you've found and explored, and how that community has traumatized people.
Well, even though the community is so-called Orthodox, it calls itself modern Orthodox, I never grew up with women covering their hair or any of that. That was not it. And also after the war, hardly anybody was, what shall I say, they were traditional, but not, they would drive to synagogue. It was more like a conservative synagogue in America.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that's sort of the European model, because the conservative movement was developed in America as a response to reform having gone too far.
Interesting.
So there is a conservative synagogue so Sweden actually is an exception in New Scandinavia, because the main synagogue there is conservative, but it started out reform because it came from Germany, because obviously the reform movement started out in Germany. But in Norway, the main synagogue has always been Orthodox. And I think because of what happened in the Holocaust, I think the collective trauma has also, that's one of my ideas, is that I think the collective trauma has prevented people from daring to do any changes to open up the doors. Because I thought by becoming a rabbi that I would start to question the structures.
Yeah.
I can see that there are some certain adjustments that have happened during the last, how many years is it now, since 2000? Well, I started in 2019 questioning these things. So, no, 2090. So we're talking about 30 years now. And I can hear certain adjustments having been made, but it's the same dialogue going on as to why we cannot have a more egalitarian service and why we cannot become a conservative community. And
what is that reason?
Well, so it should be open for all Jews all over, so anybody should feel welcome in the services, which is really not true. Because how can a woman who's grown up in an egalitarian synagogue in America, which there are quite a few of those actually, Norwegian, the women married to Norwegians from America who are here now. So what has changed the last 2 years is that as I was training, I started to have services in my home, open services, egalitarian services, also in a much more open, sort of upbeat kind of, which I would lead once a month. And we did that for about 7-8 years. But I got very tired of doing everything at home, and it was sort of, it was a time where I think that was also part of this whole thing, that I was beginning to go into a deeper level of my own healing journey. But as a result of that, there were people who really missed these gatherings. So some of them went forward, and they have now managed to open a space within the synagogue for monthly small egalitarian services in the synagogue. So that is a change.
Wow.
But what you're saying about, what about this whole being Orthodox? And so I like I said, I haven't had to deal with that, except that for me, it's not part of my story at all.
Right. I guess, what is the umbrella under which you're interviewing people? Is it just that they are second or third generation survivors of the Holocaust?
Yes, and I think one of the questions that really has or one of the answers, or one of the statements that really have brought my attention is this statement, I'm Jewish but not religious.
Right.
Which seems to be an overall theme.
Right.
Only one of the people that I've interviewed, and I haven't interviewed all that many, has openly said that she does live, she does do traditional things and raises her child within like a more traditional way of being. But as she also says, which I think is part of this modern movement, is making it her own, which was very much also my way of doing it. Like, you adapt the tradition to ways that you feel meaningful to you. But no head covering or anything like that.
Yeah. So this person who presents to you saying that I am Jewish but not religious, have you found a connection with that, I guess, presentation and trauma history?
Absolutely. I think that's directly linked to this whole collective adaptation of the Jewish people, especially under the Age of Enlightenment. Because as a collective, in order to be able to be accepted within the national states and within the Age of Reason, there was this whole dispute between Kant and this Jewish philosopher called Moses Mendelssohn, whether Jewishness could be accepted within the Enlightenment or not. Which
Wow.
Kant meant that it wasn't because it's like having to follow laws by God or something like that. Then it couldn't be ethical in the way that Christianity or Protestant Christianity could be. So there's this whole dispute. So this is where I'm immersed right now, trying to put that into words, because you see how I'm seeing that as a whole. And on the other hand, Jews were really wanting and eager to embrace the Enlightenment because it gave them an opportunity that hadn't been there since before the Middle Ages, since before the Crusades. I mean, even then it wasn't. Jews have always been marginalized within European societies. So finally, and during the last 200-300 years, it was really marginalized into self-serving small communities and ghettos in cities and so on. So there was also a willingness from a Jewish perspective to kind of let go of so much of this Jewish cultural thing, and among other things, the whole thing of as a nation returning to Israel or to Zion, this whole, that our aim as a people is to keep on going until the Messiah comes so we can come back to Israel. Whilst in the Enlightenment, one started to say, well, listen, we're citizens and we should be loyal to this whatever state we're in. And do you know what a friend of mine who's a rabbi in America, she said that because this was such a problem in Europe that they were using that against Jews, that but you are already a nation, so how can you be loyal to the national state if you're a nation already? So when Jews came to America, they made sure to identify themselves as a religious minority and not as a nation.
So the question that I've been having in my head is, what is the difference between a European Jewish experience and the American Jewish experience? And that makes a lot of sense, right? In order to create your own little group in America to be able to survive together, then the collective, I guess the assimilation looks very different in America than it is in.
Yeah. And yet Jews were not accepted even in America. They had to have their own, they weren't allowed into the white, so they were the white blacks. They weren't allowed into what's it called, the swimming pools and the country clubs and things like that. So they had to make their own, the JCCs, which are the Jewish Cultural Centers, were built because of that experience of not being accepted in those waspy places.
Yeah, it's just, you're giving me such a different perspective that I've just not heard from, a lot of my friends who are Jewish in America. There isn't this connection to the cultural history like you're sharing. And it's just it's mind expanding for me.
And the Holocaust isn't so close as it is. I mean, it's so close to us still.
I was wondering that too, right? Like just literally geographically having been closer to it.
Yeah. I mean, the department that my father's family was deported from is just around the corner from here. And, and on the street now we have little plaques. I don't know if you've been to Europe recently, but in Berlin, that's where it started. They've started to make little brass plaques with the names of all who were deported from outside of where they lived.
I hadn't been to Berlin. We went to Frankfurt, Munich, and
so I think they're there too.
Well, the thing we found was so interesting in Germany is there were a lot of plaques that would say, and then the war came. Like it was something that happened upon Germany. It wasn't born out of Germany. And it reminded me of the way that Americans treat Native Americans.
I know. And it's the same even at the Holocaust Museum here, which I was actually part of the board when they were putting it up. It's almost like the guy who's his idea was that, but the Nazism was like a parenthesis in history. And I'm saying, I'm just saying, of course it's not. It's just one more step in a much, much longer journey of othering.
Right. And it's not like the Nazis are gone away. I've been watching a lot of there's one show called Hate Thy Neighbor, and it's a Black comedian who's going into different hate groups. And the Nazis seem alive and well from what I can tell, at least on that show.
Also here.
Right.
But we also have a lot of, here in this country, many more than are Jews are those who are children of Nazis who have had to grow up with that background.
Oh, right.
which is also quite a
Wow.
difficult and a painful one too.
You're blowing my mind. Like because I'm just really feeling into the depth of this, right? And I think that's what's you're talking about earlier, wanting to lean into the nuances of this, right? If we really feel into the depth and the historical piece of the trauma, it's so big and it's so parallel to a micro family. And there are also no words because it's not the same. It's just, I'm so glad you're doing this work and and we're having this conversation.
Yeah. I didn't even know what I was going to talk to you about because it
Right.
is so difficult to put into words. And I'm struggling to put these pieces together in a way that makes sense to the reader.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Well, one question, since we were talking about, anti-Semitism certainly is still alive and well. And so being a Jewish person in the world where there are true threats, I'm always thinking about post-traumatic growth, right? When we talk about post-traumatic growth, post meaning it's over, but it's not over for you, for Black Americans, for other people of color, for other marginalized groups, right? So I don't know if you've conceptualized any of this in your work yet, or your just personal thoughts around
Yeah,
that.
not yet. I mean, one thing that really came to me after actually reading a guy called Michael Mead about myths is and initiate because I want to bring also the concept of initiation into this.
Would you say more about that?
Well, that trauma integration also has an aspect of initiation in it. That it's almost, I mean, this is something that I have come across through a woman called Carla McLaren, who then refers to Michael Mead, he's a mythologist. He works a lot with stories and has his own trauma story, which he shares in one of his books. And basically what he says that a trauma that's not healed can be likened to an initiation that never was fulfilled.
Oh.
That there are the same stages, like even before you go into a traumatic event
Hmm.
or situation, there will always be this hyper alertness. You're going into a different
Mm.
realm.
Hmm.
It's like something in you becomes hyper vigilant. You go into this anomaly state.
Hmm.
And then you have the initiation where you're usually, then in a tribe, you will have people who help you through. But in the trauma, you're raped or you're
Right.
whatever, or you're in this dysfunctional family for years and years and
Mm-hmm.
years. And in the initiation ceremonies, of course, and you can even say confirmation or a bar mitzvah is a smaller version of this. There's a helping through, and there is a coming back in a new status into the community
Mm-hmm.
where you're celebrated, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in the trauma, you're continuing to go in that loop where you're never being recognized for the hardship that you went through.
Wow.
So until that recognizing, and I think that's what's so brilliant with the NARM processes is this seeing the hardship for what it is and recognizing the depth of it.
Right.
So one of the things that I also bring out in my thesis is like how my father, one of the stories that really stick out for me is he told me that when he came back to Norway after the war and he went to the bank that used to be his family bank, he came into the bank and everybody in that bank stood up and greeted him with what's it called?
Salute.
Honored, yeah, this a
Mm.
salute.
Wow.
And I'm just thinking that
Mm.
that was part of that recognition from a collective that, listen, we know what you've been through and we recognize you and we salute you. And I think that part of the trauma healing is also so important. And I'm also thinking that that's also been one of the reasons why, for example, some of my healing could not happen within the community because
Mm.
nobody had gone through. It had to come from somewhere else, from a larger collective.
Wow. That makes so much sense. And I'm also, again, kind of paralleling this to the experience of Black Americans waiting for white Americans to validate and salute and say, yes, I see what you've
Yes.
been through. Oh my God. Wow, this is really moving. Thank you.
Yeah.
Wow. So in your work, What is inspiring you to continue hearing these stories? What keeps you going? Because talking about these trauma stories is really intense.
I think it is the importance of sharing how it's also a journey towards growth. But I think what we're talking about before, and this is what also Michael Meade was writing about, the initiation isn't just a one-time thing. It's something that probably has to be repeated. And maybe that's why we have these kind of official ceremonies, yearly ceremonies of things, because in that cyclical movement, we are able to kind of contain yet more of that pain and heal a bit more, that it's not a one-time thing.
Right. And that's so counter to most of the messages in Western culture.
Yes, we want it to be over. We want it to be over with, fix it, finished with. And that by integrating it and by being able to hold your pain, the gift is that you're able to be alive and see others in their pain, right?
Okay, that just blew my mind. Just thinking about my own process in this, I continue to bump up against this edge of wanting it to be linear, wanting to, okay, like when do I reach a point where I'm free of this? And it's just, I felt that deep in my soul about the cycles and the continuing to integrate. I'm going to take that into therapy.
Yeah, no, because it was also, it's been hard for me because I've been thinking that, but I'm not finished yet. How can I write this?
Right.
It's hallelujah every day.
Right. Wow.
But I'm more in place. I'm more in resting in myself. I'm more content.
Right. And, if I can just share my observations too, from this place of real connectedness within yourself, I feel, and I hope the listeners really feel, the healing quality that you imbue just by being.
Yeah.
That's so wonderful. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. So is there anything else that you'd like to share with people that we haven't talked about? I mean, there's so many other things. I feel like we're going to need to do a part 2, but for now.
But wait until I'm finished with my thesis.
Fair enough.
So if there's anything else that I think we've covered a lot, haven't we? And I do actually also work one-on-one with a few people. I do have a few clients now, which is exciting to try that out too. But it's but what I am especially trying to do is to translate these concepts into more general terms so that they're not just something that we talk about within the therapeutic room.
Right, because we won't be able to create cultural change unless we're talking outside too. Well, Lynn, what a treasure. This conversation was just so moving and expansive, and I feel so very blessed to have had this with you.
Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you too, so thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. If you want to learn more, you can check out the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Please join us for our online NARM training in learning how to transform trauma. This online NARM basics training is available for professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Join us for this level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. For more information and to apply, please visit at www.narmtraining.com/online-basics. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We really look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.